Welcome once again to this course on self-knowledge. Today we'll explore the 23rd topic of our journey, an important one that focuses on two psychological aspects we must understand and overcome: fanaticism and mythomania. These two defects are serious obstacles that can completely block any real progress on the inner path. In fact, in earlier times, this was the very first lecture given to anyone aspiring to awaken their consciousness, because one of the earliest challenges we face on this path is self-deception. The goal of this lecture is to help us recognize these defects within ourselves, both fanaticism and mythomania. We need to learn how to observe how they show up in our own psyche. It's easy to notice these traits in others, but the real challenge is to detect them within ourselves, often hidden in subtle ways. And most importantly, we need to understand the consequences of falling into self-deception because of these psychological defects. Let's begin by talking about fanaticism. What exactly is fanaticism? A fanatic is someone who shows excessive zeal or passion for a belief. This defect can express itself in anything we strongly believe in, anything we feel the urge to defend with intensity, even aggression. The fanatic clings to their belief with rigid attachment. They don't want anyone to question it or even touch it. And when someone challenges that belief or offers a different perspective, the fanatic reacts with anger, rage, and sometimes even violence. Fanaticism makes us feel that what we believe is superior to what others believe, and that simply by believing in it, we are somehow better or more special than others. This is one of the traps of fanaticism. It convinces us that just because we believe in something, we're already safe. And fanaticism isn't limited to religion. We can become fanatics about many things: sports teams, celebrities, political figures, ideas, or movements. But perhaps the most dangerous form is religious fanaticism. In that case, people feel that their very salvation is on the line. This fear often overrides reason and leads to blind, aggressive defense of a belief or ideology, even without reflection. Fanaticism blinds us to the truth that our beliefs are often nothing more than social conditioning, ideas we never truly verified for ourselves, but simply absorbed from our environment, culture, or upbringing. In fact, if we had been born somewhere else in the world, we would likely hold very different beliefs and defend them just as fiercely. In this way, fanaticism becomes a kind of mental illness. The fanatic feels chosen or favored by God merely because they believe in something, and in extreme cases, they might even lose their moral compass, beating or abandoning their children for not following the family's beliefs, attacking others over political or sports-related views, or even killing in the name of religion. Why does this happen? Because the psychological defect of fanaticism clouds our ability to distinguish belief from reality. It gives rise to blind faith, a kind of belief that discourages inquiry. Blind faith is often fueled by fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of hell, and many times this blind faith is intentionally encouraged by those who tell you, "Don't question, just believe." It's also important to understand that fanaticism exists on both sides, not only religious or spiritual, but also atheist. A religious fanatic might blindly accept ideas about divinity without ever verifying them. But just the same, an atheist might cling tightly to materialistic views, refusing to explore or even consider the possibility of higher realities or spiritual experiences. Both are trapped in rigid belief systems without direct knowledge. So how do we recognize the fanatic within ourselves? We can start by noticing how we react when someone disagrees with us, especially when someone challenges a belief or preference we hold dear. Do we feel defensive, irritated, even furious? We can also observe that part of us that is content with just believing, that never seeks real, personal experience or direct investigation of spiritual truth. And that part of us that believes salvation comes simply from belonging to a religion or believing in a specific God. In reality, salvation, true inner transformation, comes from conscious work on ourselves. It comes from knowing ourselves deeply and awakening our full consciousness. Now, once we receive this knowledge, once we understand what needs to be done to awaken our consciousness, two paths open before us: the path of the believer and the path of the practitioner. As soon as we begin to resonate with this teaching, our inner fanatic will try to push us toward the path of the believer. Unfortunately, that's the path most people end up taking. The believer is someone who thinks that simply knowing is enough, and from that moment on begins to act as if they are already a saint. The believer wants others to see them as someone who's changing. They want to feel aligned with the belief they now profess, and so they begin to repress their defects, especially when they're in public or around people they're not close to. They present themselves as kind, patient, even holy. But when they're alone or with people they trust, like close family or friends, they reveal their true state. The defects they never really worked on come to the surface because they were only being suppressed, not transformed. A particular trait of this believer mindset is that it's highly intellectual. This person loves to absorb knowledge, but only on an intellectual level. They're always looking for more texts, more books, more theories. They want to feel informed, but they don't like to practice. They'll watch videos, read about things, but they won't actually do the practices. And this is a very common mistake in these teachings. Believing that just because we're learning new concepts, our consciousness is awakening. But that's completely false. Awakening doesn't come through intellectual knowledge alone. It comes only through walking the other path, the path of the practitioner. The practical person, on the other hand, doesn't just believe everything they hear. Instead, they focus on practicing in order to verify what they've learned. They make an effort to apply the tools they've been given, with patience, with discipline, until they begin to see real results. Through the wisdom that comes from their own inner work, the practitioner becomes truly independent. They no longer need to rely on the opinions or beliefs of others, because their understanding comes from direct personal experience. This kind of knowledge is real because it has been tested and confirmed through practice. It's not borrowed, it's lived. And that's why the practitioner is the one who actually begins to advance on the inner path, because real progress only comes from the work we do, consciously and consistently. Through the daily effort to apply the 3 factors for the revolution of consciousness and through practices that lead to verification, the practitioner walks the path of transformation. Because without psychological death, there can be no liberation of consciousness. And without that liberation, we cannot recover the wisdom that is trapped within our psychological defects. If we don't practice spiritual birth, we won't develop the existential bodies, and without them, we won't be able to access the wisdom of our being across the different dimensions of nature. If we don't sacrifice for humanity, we won't develop real love, and our inner progress will be blocked. And ultimately, if we don't practice, we won't be able to verify anything for ourselves. The practitioner understands all of this and begins to apply the teachings, showing through their life the results of their inner work. And this deeply irritates the fanatic, who, driven by laziness and envy, still hopes to achieve self-realization without doing the work. That's why it's important to analyze these traits of the fanaticism defect, so we can begin to discover them within ourselves through self-observation. Only by recognizing and eliminating this defect from our psychology can we move forward in our inner development. Here are some specific signs or behaviors we can look for. The fanatic doesn't like to practice. They enjoy listening to the teachings, but rarely take the step to apply them. And if they do try, they often give up at the first failure. As a result, they don't develop real personal knowledge. They're content simply repeating what they've heard from others, and for that, they usually rely on some leader or figure to believe in. This creates dependency. They don't cultivate inner autonomy or true inner strength. Fanatics also tend to be highly intellectual. They believe they know more than others, and in this we can see clear traces of pride and a sense of superiority. Fanatics tend to be followers of people. They're always looking for someone who seems wise or advanced, someone they can follow to feel safe and secure. They constantly seek an external master to guide them, but they don't turn inward to connect with their true master, their inner being. Instead, they imitate others. They rely on the experiences of others, and they often go around affirming things they haven't actually verified, just repeating what someone else said. They talk about spiritual experiences they don't truly understand because those experiences don't belong to them. Fanatics are often driven by envy. They feel uncomfortable around those who show real inner work because envy leads them to compare themselves, and they can't stand feeling inferior. So when someone genuinely tries to practice, the fanatic often steps in to discourage them, trying to take away their motivation and strength. Ironically, the fanatic may even start labeling others as fanatics, pointing out flaws in everything others do, yet never looking at themselves and never doing the work they criticize others for attempting. The fanatic is also lazy. They believe the inner path is easy, as simple as snapping your fingers. They're satisfied just talking about the teachings, but because of their laziness, they don't actually practice or verify anything. So they talk about psychological death, but they don't die to their defects. They speak about spiritual birth, but they don't engage in suprasexual practices. They could sacrifice more for humanity, but they don't. They settle for doing the bare minimum. And although they may tell others to practice, they themselves avoid it out of pure laziness. There's an important detail we must observe about this fanatical defect, something that exists in all of us. It's known as the false feeling of the self. This is a deep-rooted illusion that makes us believe we're doing just fine, and because of that, it prevents real progress. This defect blinds us to the truth that all our psychological defects are still alive and active, that we haven't eliminated them, that practice, not belief, is what makes a master, that we haven't yet created the existential bodies of the being, that awakening the Kundalini requires us to stop being traitors disguised as gentle sheep. The inner work is still ahead of us, and perhaps the worst mistake of all is to believe and feel that we are good people, because that prevents us from looking for true self-discovery and change. Another trait of fanaticism is tyranny. When we feel the need to defend our faith or our version of the truth, we often believe we're justified in imposing it on others, convinced that we're doing it for their own good. When fanatics find themselves in a position of power, they often use fear or guilt to pressure others into accepting their beliefs. We can recognize this defect in ourselves when we try to force our friends, partner, or children to accept what we believe, thinking we're saving them. The fanatic always believes they are better than others and sees those who don't accept the teaching as condemned or lost. Another important trait of fanaticism is its connection to a false mysticism. The fanatical defect tends to turn knowledge into a kind of religion, adding religious elements and external forms because it is attached to ritual. It becomes focused on outer appearances, the clothing, the postures, the ceremonies. And the fanatic begins to believe that these external things are what really matter in the inner work. Eventually, anything that doesn't fit within their mystical framework is seen as wrong or impure, and they start labeling it as negative simply because it doesn't align with their personal beliefs. In conclusion, fanaticism buries us. It turns us into mediocre forces, into beings who are ultimately useless for real inner work. That's why it's so important to study and eliminate the fanatic I within us. Only then can we truly move forward on the path of self-knowledge and inner transformation. Now let's turn to another psychological defect that also leads us into self-deception: mythomania. Mythomania is surprisingly common, especially among those involved in various metaphysical or spiritual schools. Seemingly ordinary people, after a few hallucinations or vivid dreams, suddenly begin to fall into this pattern, becoming mythomaniacs almost overnight. It often begins with a lie, and after repeating it enough times, the person can no longer tell if it really happened or not. The mythomaniac becomes accustomed to lying, and eventually no longer sees anything wrong with it. They lie to convince others, and in the end, they deceive themselves. That's why it's so important to become aware of even the smallest signs of this defect within us, and begin to work on it through reflective meditation. Often, mythomania stems from feelings of inferiority. To feel important or accepted, a person begins to exaggerate, adding details to their stories that never really happened. They want to impress. they want to be admired. So they begin to invent stories about astral experiences, about supernatural powers, claiming things like I've opened my third eye, or I've made contact with angels, or I've spoken with extraterrestrials. But all of this is just part of a false story they've built, driven by the desire to appear special. So, what is the mythomaniac really looking for? They want to impress others, to amaze those who are naive or inexperienced, who hear these fantastic stories and believe them. And once impressed, these people often become their followers. That's the goal of the mythomaniac, to gain admiration, influence, and attention through lies dressed as spiritual experiences. The mythomaniac often lives in fantasies filled with impossible dreams and delusions of grandeur. In their mind, they imagine themselves to be special, important, or extraordinary, and they end up believing it. Then, they present themselves to others as the reincarnation of some legendary master or mythical hero. The danger of this defect is that it not only distorts our own inner path, but it also causes harm to the spiritual journey of many others. That is why it's essential to observe and identify the details of the mythomaniac defect within ourselves, so we can begin to eliminate them. Some of those details include the delusion of grandeur, which appears when we feel the need to appear superior or special, that urge to impress others, to make them believe we are extraordinary. Also, the tendency to lie, every time we add to or remove parts of our stories just to make them sound more impressive. Then there's the need to have followers. A person who is truly awakening their consciousness encourages others to seek and follow their own inner being, not to follow someone external. The mythomaniac, however, creates dependence. They manipulate others, making them believe they need him. They make absurd predictions. They generate fear, causing people to feel more insecure and thus more dependent. They speak ill of others, criticize, and spread discredit. They label others as black magicians. It's important to observe which of these traits we might carry in our own psychology and to reflect further to discover even more, because as we can see, this defect will block any true progress in our awakening. One interesting question to reflect on is, how are mythomaniacs formed? Often, it begins with personification. This defect becomes a mental illness, and the person starts believing they are some exalted or divine being. Sometimes it starts with misinterpreted dreams. For instance, they may have watched a movie or read about a legendary hero or an important figure in history, and later, because their consciousness is asleep, they dream about that character. Then they begin to fantasize, until they're convinced they are the reincarnation of that character. There are also external factors that can contribute to the development of mythomania, such as the use of drugs or hallucinogenic substances, or going through extreme experiences like surviving near-death situations and then believing they were chosen by God. And in other cases, fanaticism plays a role. A person becomes a devoted follower of some mythomaniac who eventually convinces them that they too are an enlightened or superior being. But all of this only happens because the person lacks seriousness. They're not working on themselves, they're not striving to awaken their consciousness, and they're not seeking guidance from their own inner being. But in the end, all these mythomaniacs are like a wall without a foundation. They shine for a moment like will-o'-the-wisps, only to fade away shortly after, leaving behind confusion and deep disorientation among their followers. Eventually, the truth comes out. Sooner or later, these mythomaniacs are exposed. It's revealed that they were frauds, sometimes even abusers or rapists. And the saddest part of it all is this: the people who followed them end up disillusioned, and often lose their spiritual longing entirely. The purpose of this reflection is to help us recognize the urgent need to work on the defects of fanaticism and mythomania within ourselves. We must understand that these defects have imprisoned a significant portion of our consciousness and that they have the power to block our awakening. That's why it is essential to confront them through psychological death. Each of these subhuman elements must be eliminated if we want to set the essence free. Only by liberating the essence can real awakening happen, and only then does true illumination begin to emerge. Let's keep in mind that the worst form of self-deception is when we begin to believe and feel that we are good, elevated, or holy. Because the moment we believe this, we stop sensing the need for change. We lose the revolutionary impulse, and we become stuck indefinitely in our inner development. This concludes today's conference. I hope it has inspired some useful reflections. Feel free to leave your questions in the comments. I warmly invite you to our next conference where we'll explore how to transform our life by transforming and elevating our level of being. It's a powerful topic. Don't miss it. Until next time, keep working on yourself.